Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. It's never a bad idea to open a program with a quote from Mark Twain. Here's Twain's definition of a classic book, a book which people praise and don't read. Fortunately, my guest today enjoys reading immensely. Kenneth Davis. He's also a historian and best-selling author. His latest book is bursting with classics, great short books. A delightful guide to some of the best short novels ever written. Ken Davis's Year of Magical Reading, next. Kenneth Davis, good to see you again.
It's always a pleasure, Tony. Thanks for having me back. We usually talk about terrible things like pandemics and the end of democracy, but today we'll talk about reading and books. And
a delightful subject. I'm so glad you wrote this. This is a delightful read, and you can dip in and out of it wherever you want. Great short books. But as you suggest, you're known for writing history, and here you talk about the balm of reading fiction, the BALM, balm of reading fiction. Why?
Why? Because, Tony, during the worst days of the pandemic, I was in the same boat we were all in, feeling stressed, anxious, sleepless, and I was doom scrolling, that word that we all come to learn too well. Doom scrolling through these headlines, and at a certain point I said, this is enough, I have to do something else. And because it was the pandemic, this is early 2020, I started to read one tale a day from Boccaccio's The Decameron, a classic of Western literature.
During or after another plague.
It was written during the Black Death in Florence, Italy. And Boccaccio wrote 100 short stories. He called novellas. He had 7 characters, 7 women and 3 men go off to a villa in Florence, and they tell each other stories every day. And I realized as I read Boccaccio, to read something great during the plague, written during the plague, that he was onto something. Short is beautiful. So I began to read fiction again. As a historian, I'd really concentrated on reading nonfiction. But I started reading fiction again because there was a feeling of not escape, but an antidote. I was reading for insight. I was reading for inspiration. And so I turned to short books in particular. Again, following Boccaccio's lead, short is beautiful. And I read 58 short books in the course of a year, and then went on to research the writers behind them. So it became a way for me to just not distract or escape from reality, but to find a different reality, and fiction provides that.
Better reality than we were
in many ways.
Yes.
But it's not getting away from the real world. In many cases, it's
diving into many worlds.
Absolutely. You know, fiction, we think of it as it can be an escape. Of course, you read an Agatha Christie and you're transported to some lovely British Isle where somebody, of course, is murdered, and Hercule Poirot comes along and solves it in a few hundred pages. But that's one way we escape with fiction. But this was more about learning what I think of as the truth. A great writer, Joseph Conrad, said that a writer provides that glimpse of truth for which we've forgotten to ask. And that's what I found in these books. Many of them get at the real important truths that we should learn and think about, even though they're told through fiction, stories that are made up.
Well, we're going to get to many of those truths today. Tell me, so it's 58 books, short novels that you recommend in here, and what was the criteria?
Well, first of all, it had to be short. So what is short? For me, that meant 200 pages or less. Much longer than that just isn't short anymore. There are a couple of exceptions. On the other end, there are 2 stories that are around 50 pages long. Shorter than that gets to be a long short story. But the 2 very short pieces I selected, one by Richard Wright, Big Boy Leaves Home, and one by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, No One Writes to the Colonel. They're just such wonderful stories. I had to include them. but they're also a way to be introduced, and this is part of the idea of the book, to be introduced to these great writers. We all don't want to pick up a full novel.
Good point.
100 Years of Solitude is a challenge for many people. But you read No One Writes to the Colonel, and it's an introduction to this wonderful, magical writer.
I was thinking 100 Years of Solitude is Marquez's masterpiece, but that's not the way in necessarily to Marquez.
This is an entry, this is a stepping stone into many of these great writers, some of whose names are very familiar. There are Pulitzer Prize winners and familiar writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, but many of them are less familiar, especially to American readers. The other criteria I had was half of the books are written by men and half by women. I wanted to have a gender balance. And then I wanted to revisit some of the classics, as you mentioned, Mark Twain's quote about the classics. I wanted to revisit some of the books that certainly I had read earlier in my life, but also introduce myself to new writers. And for instance, I was learning Italian at that time at Borough Manhattan Community College, part of CUNY.
This organization.
That's right, and we love that institution, and we miss it during the pandemic. But some of my professors had recommended Italian writers, and so there are several very significant Italian writers included in this. Including the very first story in the book is called Agostino by a writer named Alberto Moravia. And it's very important to realize that as I was doing this and talking about and writing and reading about these authors, how many of them that I included, somewhat coincidentally, were people who had to confront fascism, Nazism, Stalin. Solzhenitsyn, of course, is in there as the person who was writing about being in Stalin's gulag. So very important to connect history. As a historian, it's very important to me to connect the history to these writers. These writers are not writing in a vacuum. They're reflecting the times in which they live, and I think that's another important piece of this story.
I'll just tell the viewers quickly the structure. Ken quotes the first couple of lines of a story, summarizes the plot, tells us why he believes you should read it, and suggests other writing by that particular writer. So, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages about each of the 58 books. And as we were touching on before, you were saying the truths that can be found here. There are themes running through these selections, and one of them is banning of books, because many of the writers of these 58 were targets. Their books were targets.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's an incredibly important piece of this story, and not one that I was thinking about when I set out to write the book, but certainly by the time it was finished and was going into production, this whole new wave of book banning and censorship was really taking hold around the country. And I went back and did a quick count. More than half of the 58 writers that I've included here have either been censored, banned, and in some cases had their books burned. Going back to the very first writer in the collection, Voltaire, 1759. Voltaire's books were burned in Paris because they were seen as heretical. By the way, the book I included by Voltaire is Candide. It's the oldest book in the collection, but by far one of the freshest and funniest. So it is really the sense that classics do have a timeless quality. That book could have been written last week and it would still be as vibrant and funny and exciting as it is when it was written centuries ago.
Book banning in this country now has reached alarming proportions. I think the American Library Association and Penn they do an annual survey.
That's
and
right.
They say there was a record number of these last year, and this year even more.
That's right, Tony, and it's a really important issue to me personally, and one I've been following and writing about for a long time. Long before I wrote the history books that many people know me for, don't know much about history. First of all, which came out a little over 30 years ago. It's hard for me to believe it when I say that, but yes. My very first book, published book, was a book about books.
Right.
It was called Two-Bit Culture. It was published in 1984. Also scary to think that I've been doing this for 40 years. But
you don't look a day over 41.
in that book, I wrote an entire chapter about censorship because it's always been with us. And why do people want to censor books? Why do people want to suppress writers? It's not because they use dirty words or they might have sexy scenes. That's certainly part of it. But censorship is really about controlling ideas, controlling thought. And that's why it's so dangerous in this time that we are in, that we're seeing this tremendous rise of censorship around the country. And it goes hand in hand with the threat to democracy that we're seeing, which I've also written about in my book Strongman, which we talked about a few years ago.
You were here talking about Strongman and the dictators of history.
That's why I think that this book is meant to be fun. It's meant to be an interesting way to get involved in reading and read different things and get the pleasure and the value of reading. But it's also about these very important ideas that books matter because they can teach us, they can change us, they can introduce new ideas to us, and that's so important. So many of these writers, again, come back to a few of them, have been imprisoned or banned, or Solzhenitsyn, of course, the best example, in prison under Stalin for many years, and writes this wonderful book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich.
I was, well, in terms of contemporary book banning, the governor of Virginia, I think this year, banned Beloved. That's Toni Morrison's, perhaps her masterwork. But he didn't agree with the way it portrays Americans in terms of how we relate to slavery and the violence and the way she depicts it. But more to your point about, this isn't just about sexy words or scenes. It seems to me it's a political and cultural war against, what would you call it? Against mainstream ideas, against the mainstream idea, which I think I'm going to define the mainstream as white and male, and
Christian,
anything and Christian, and anything that challenges that, or many of the things that are perceived to challenge that, are the books that people are trying to ban.
Absolutely, democracy thrives on the ability to express our ideas and the freedom to read and the freedom to write. And that's why this is so much more than just, what a few people in a few communities think is dangerous. And there's a flip side of it. You mentioned Mark Twain when we started out.
Yes.
Huckleberry Finn was banned in New York City in the 1950s.
I was surprised to learn that. I did not know that.
It's one of the few examples on the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, of books that are being challenged or banned or censored around the country. By far, most of them are books that are written by people of color, women, gay and lesbian writers. And so these are the books that people fear these ideas. We can't fear ideas because this is the essence of what the First Amendment means.
A parent has a right to exercise control over what his child or her child reads, but doesn't have the right to impose his objection on every other child who might be in that class or who might use that library. That's where it goes
That's
over.
absolutely the case. And I talked to a great many of teachers and librarians, school librarians in particular, who understand this. And they say there's no question that if a parent were to object to a child reading, for instance, The House on Mango Street, a book that's included in this, which is banned, challenged, censored all the time and has been for decades, a wonderful book by a woman named Sandra Cisneros. If a parent objected to their child reading that book as an assignment or even having it in the library, the librarian or the teacher is free to say, well, here's are suggested alternatives. But it doesn't mean that you can tell everyone else in the class that they cannot read that ever. And reading brings us freedom. Another quick story I'll tell you, I cited in the book, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist who was born enslaved, understood when he was a very young boy that he wasn't allowed to learn his ABCs. He was actually forbidden.
Right.
He describes it in his narrative. And he understood that not being able to read was one way that the white man kept him enslaved. But he understood that education and reading are the key to freedom, to liberation.
Of course.
And that applies to all of us.
The themes that are present in these selections, and book one of them, another one is authoritarianism. You referred to it a moment ago. Book banning kind of goes hand in hand with dictatorship, authoritarianism, whatever you want to, however you want to put it.
Absolutely, and that also became a theme that, again, I was not deliberately setting out to include these books, but more and more of them came in for something as simple as Animal Farm, which was subtitled A Fairy Story by George Orwell, and probably a lot of people read it maybe in junior high school or high school. Such an important book to read right now as we face this authoritarian threat around the world, and certainly to a degree in this country. It's a fable, an allegory about how people take power, and even out of something seemingly a good idea, that all the animals should be free.
All animals are equal.
That's
but some are more equal than others. Some animals are more equal than others.
Yes, it starts out as all animals are equal, but by the end, this is a spoiler, I suppose, but maybe not a big one. Some animals are more equal than others. So this is a very, very fundamental idea, how a strong man, a dictator, in the guise of a pig named Napoleon, completely takes over an idea that is meant to liberate people and turns it into complete control over people. That becomes quite murderous.
Yeah, and it's hard not to see Animal Farm terribly and sadly relevant to, all we have to do is look back at January 6th and the Capitol after the last presidential election. I mean, that was an insurrection. That's a challenge to democracy. People are going to say, I'm woke or something. I just don't understand that, how you can read that any other way.
No, I agree completely. As a historian, as somebody who studied American history and spent most of my professional career writing and talking about the past and what we are confronting. This is a very, very dangerous, fraught moment for American democracy. Many of these books that I've included, Animal Farm among them, are about the threat of the authoritarian. Many of the writers, as I mentioned earlier, faced authoritarians. Natalia Ginsburg, a name that might not be familiar to most Americans, she was sent into what was known as confino in Italy. Her husband was actually exiled by Mussolini's regime. He later moved back to Rome, and under the Nazis, with Mussolini's agreement, he was actually imprisoned and murdered by the Nazis. So this is a woman who confronted fascism face to face. Alberto Moravia, who I mentioned, had to flee from Rome because his books were being censored by the fascists, and he was actually then put on a list, which was a very dangerous thing to do. Another book that's very, very important, and it's the one exception that it's nonfiction in the book, is a book called If This Is a Man by Primo Levi. It's an account of his being taken as an Italian Jew to Auschwitz. It's one of the most powerful books about the Holocaust, and that's one of the reasons I included it, even though it's written in a very fictional style, and he was a fiction writer as well. These are people who confronted authoritarianism, totalitarianism, dictators, a strong man, all of these words that we use, and it completely colored their writing experiences, and that's why I've included so many of these stories.
Yeah, there was a haunting, disturbing, I guess, I don't guess, it was very disturbing exhibit at the New York Historical Society this summer called A Century of Defending the Written Word, supported by Penn. And I remember passing through the galleries and seeing a photo of Nazis burning books in Germany in 1933. And
Correct.
Book banning and authoritarianism can lead to book burning, as you know. And I wonder, would it be too much to worry that may be next here? Or?
No, I don't think it's too much to worry about that at all, because we've seen that history happen. Certainly in Germany in 1933, it happened in, you can go down the list of the authoritarians I wrote about in Strongman. Mussolini banned writers, chased them out of the country. Germany, we know about the book burnings in 1933. Stalin, of course, executed writers who he didn't like or send them to the Gulag, like Solzhenitsyn, whose book is included here. Mao Zedong, the same. The writers in China were suppressed. So it's very, very clearly a line that goes from this censorship. And we have experienced it before in this country, even though we do have the First Amendment that is supposed to protect our rights to read, our rights to express ourselves. In the 1830s, they burned abolitionist pamphlets in this country.
Yes.
And the president at the time, Andrew Jackson, banned them in the mails. But in 1953, it was a different kind of censorship. It was Joseph McCarthy trying to keep anything that he thought was subversive out of the libraries. And he sent the attorney, Roy Cohen, to Europe, and they actually took books out of the shelves from the U.S. State Department libraries and cleared out the shelves. And this was a widespread thing.
The threat of communism,
that's right. This was the fear of communism. And at that time, you mentioned the American Library Association before. It was at that time in 1953 that they issued their first Freedom to Read Declaration. It's a very important document because the librarians really were standing up against Joseph McCarthy in a way that even the President Eisenhower at the time, wouldn't. So the threat that comes from people saying you can't read this book is very real, and it is a short step from saying you can't read this to clearing out the libraries. You mentioned Berlin in 1933. At the site of that book burning in Berlin, there is a plaque now that is quotation from a much earlier German poet who wrote, "Where they burn books, they will eventually burn people." And that's a chilling statement, and a very true one. So that's why I and a great many other people who believe in this idea of freedom of expression and believing that we should read any books we want to read, fear this moment that we are in right now.
Why do you think so many banned books become classics?
You mentioned before Toni Morrison and Beloved. Beloved is not in Great Short Books, but Toni Morrison's book Sula is.
Sula, yes.
Again, a great way to take a step into Toni Morrison. Beloved is a difficult, challenging book, but Sula is this wonderful book that introduces you to the extraordinary poetry, the voice of Toni Morrison, but also writing about the things that animate her writing, her concerns about race and the role of women in society and the role of women with each other. These are really important themes. They're important ideas. They're written about in a way that brings them to life, that allows us, again, to see the truth in the world. Fiction isn't about made-up stories. Fiction, the best fiction, is often about showing us truth. And that's why so many of these books that make people uncomfortable, which is why they are banned, they make them uncomfortable, they make us think about the world in different ways. They are censored, they are suppressed. Eventually, they are recognized for being the great works that they are.
Exactly. Yeah, there's so much joy in reading great short books and reading Kenneth Davis's selection, the 58 that are here. I mean, you mentioned the house on Mango Street. I made some notes on just a few that I just want to point out. We've talked about No One Writes to the Colonel, and I'm going to have to go back and look at that because I'm such a big fan of Marquez, but I hadn't read that. You got The Postman Always Rings Twice. Great movie, and of course a piece of fiction by...
Another banned book.
Another banned book by James McCain. If Beale Street Could Talk, James Baldwin, the theme of oppressive judicial system and racist policing, couldn't be more timely, but an enjoyable read. The Country Girls, Edna O'Brien, what a wonderful book.
Burned by her priest in her hometown in Ireland.
And a fellow you should know more about if you haven't come across him, who lives right here in Brooklyn, Colson Whitehead, who you include here with his short novel, The Nickel Boys, but he's been just celebrated for recent fiction.
Absolutely, a two-time Pulitzer winner at a very young age. That's a rare achievement. And The Nickel Boys is actually the most recently written book included in this selection. So it really does go from 1759, Voltaire, to Colson Whitehead in 2019. So the book covers a wide range of genres, time, people, and writing styles, but I want to make clear that part of this is really to celebrate the joy of reading.
Exactly.
And to celebrate the value that reading brings to us. There are a great many studies that really talk about how important reading is for stimulating the mind, for stress reduction. There's a Yale study that I cite that also says reading can add longevity. You can add 2 years to your life by reading.
I'm ready for that.
That's the bonus.
That's the bonus. There's plenty of bonus just right here between the pages of great short books by Kenneth Davis. It is a delight anytime you're here.
Thank
you.
So
please write another book quickly and come back.
I'm working on it. That's what we do. We write.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.